The idea that we do not know ourselves well, and that we are frequently mistaken in our estimation of ourselves and of others, and that we hide uncomfortable truths from ourselves, is central to both psychoanalysis and to literature. And in this paper, I suggest that this capacity for hiding the truth from ourselves may have something to do with finding ourselves embroiled in a level of ecological debt that, although it dwarfs anything that Lehman Brothers has so far run up in the financial world, provokes only a limited political or personal response. A number of writers have used the psychoanalytic perspective to explore why so little attention is paid to environmental problems. But in this paper, I'm interested in what happens to those who do manage to acknowledge them. Do you want me to move this mic a bit? Is that better? Okay. Okay, so I'm interested in what happens psychologically to people who do manage to engage with environmental problems. What happens to those who try to face the truth of ecological debt? And in this paper, I compare their journeys with that of Pip in Dickens' novel, Great Expectations, using concepts from psychoanalysis to elucidate both the book and the experiences of people who have spoken to me about this. The stories come from interviews conducted from this paper, from stories posted to a website I set up about personal responsibilities to ecological debt called What's Your Pip Story? And from participants in Carbon Conversations groups, which, as Anna explained, they're psychologically based groups which try to help people work through the problems associated with engaging with these issues. I'm going to talk first about Great Expectations. The novel opens on a windswept late December afternoon on the bleak Kent marshes, an inhospitable landscape of fen and ditch running to the river where prison hulks are moored. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Maybe a little slower.
A bit slower.
Yes.
Okay.
Slower.
Okay.
Keep the volume up as well.
Okay. Pip, the hero and narrator, 7 years old and an orphan, is sheltering in the graveyard, puzzling over the inscription on his parents' grave before returning home to the house he shares with his shrewish sister and her husband, the blacksmith, Joe Gargery. Out of the mist emerges the most terrifying figure the 7-year-old Pip has ever met. An escaped convict, rattling a leg iron, cursing, threatening, and demanding that Pip should fetch him food and a file to remove the chain that hobbles him. The encounter marks Pip's life, though not in a way that is immediately apparent to him. Those who are familiar with the story will remember that Pip appears to find favour with the reclusive Miss Havisham, who requires a boy to visit her. On these puzzling visits, he meets and falls in love with her ward, the beautiful but cold Estella. On reaching adulthood, he is told by the lawyer Jaggers that he has been chosen by a mysterious benefactor to receive an education as a gentleman. Pip believes that his benefactor must be Miss Havisham, that he is destined for Estella, and that the favour he finds is connected to his feeling of deserving more than the dull life of an apprenticeship to the generous but loving Joe. The novel interests me for its description of Pip's reaction when he discovers the true identity of his benefactor and finds that person to be quite other than who he imagined. His debt does not lie where he thought it did. He is indebted not to some intrinsic merit in himself, and not to the wealthy Miss Havisham, but to Margaret, the convict who he helped that cold, harsh day on the marshes by fetching him food and a file to remove his leg iron. Pip's initial reactions are similar to those of many people when they discover the extent of what is sometimes called ecological debt. The moment when someone realises that the goods, services and conveniences they enjoy do not come courtesy of their own hard work, or because they are particularly deserving, but carry a cost to others and to the rest of the natural world. Pip, confronted with Margaret, feels shock and disbelief he denies the truth, and he longs for flight. The journey he then goes on involves revisiting developmental processes that psychoanalysis writes about richly. The young child's gradual disillusion with the grand sense of his... Sorry?
Not too fast, please.
Sorry. The young child's gradual disillusion with the grand sense of his or her own importance. The collision with the reality principle. The realization that others have given in order for him or her to receive. The achievement of the depressive position. Pip reworks Oedipal dilemmas, reframes his identity, learns compassion, humility, and the meaning of forgiveness. Ecological debt has a similar potential to return people to developmental processes that, if they thought about them at all, they considered resolved and finished with. So I'll just say a little bit about ecological debt. I imagine most people here are familiar with this concept. But it's a balance sheet of who has used what natural resources, and therefore who might be indebted to whom. In the view of the economist Andrew Sims, if you take more than your fair share of a finite natural resource, you run up an ecological debt. If you have a lifestyle that pushes an ecosystem beyond its ability to renew itself, you run up an ecological debt. This is a different way of understanding economic relations, one that grounds us in the real world of natural resources. And unlike the debts that drive the economy, ecological debts do not appear in the annual accounts of corporations or on the overdraft statements of individuals. The negotiation of the debt is unclear. The repayment terms are hazy. The interest rate has not been settled, and in many cases, no agreement has been made to pay. Ecological debt may be owed to the global commons, it may be owed to other species, other habitats, other people, and it may be owed to future generations. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. The most recognisable debt to the global commons at present lies in the damage to the Earth's fragile stability through rising carbon dioxide emissions. And this graph shows the position of a number of nations on either side of the balance sheet. It's showing per capita carbon emissions, with the United States here at the left, a small population but very high emissions. You can compare that with China down here. A very similar area is covered, but the per capita emissions are much lower. And of course you will notice that most nations in this world are living lives where we are in ecological debt. There are other straightforward examples you're probably very familiar with. You might think about the relationship between the cheap t-shirt that you go shopping for in Primark on a Saturday afternoon and the devastation of ecosystems and livelihoods in Uzbekistan, where the Aral Sea has shrunk to only 15% of its former volume, exposing 50,000 square kilometres of its seabed. And this is a direct result of water extraction for cotton growing. In each of those t-shirts, there is 5,000 litres of water. Sorry, in both of those t-shirts, 2,500 each. One might similarly point to the products of the oil industry, the plastics, the pharmaceuticals, the holidays, the commutes, the thousands of entertaining and ephemeral gadgets, and set them in relationship to the ecological destruction caused by the oil industry in the Niger Delta. And finally, we might think about future generations, not just of people, but of other species and all the creatures that live in those habitats. And this requires us to imagine and value life beyond our own. The idea of ecological debt emphasises the underlying obscured relationships between the most ordinary artefacts and behaviours and the devastation of the natural world. The idea that one is indebted in these ways can be hard to take in. People rarely make these connections. The relationships are not apparent to them, and their reaction to being shown them is often similar to that of Pip when confronted by Margaret: shock and angry disbelief. Developmentally, of course, life is full of such surprises. children discover that their parents do not always enjoy parenthood, that they get tired, they don't like their jobs, they want time to themselves, and sometimes find the children a nuisance. Gradually, children are introduced to the reality that they are not the centre of the universe, that their needs do not always come first, and that their demands cause pain or trouble to others. They discover that greed and selfishness have consequences, that they will not marry mummy or daddy, that they will not live forever, that their siblings expect a share too, and that life does not feel fair. Debt can be positioned as one of a series of possible relationships to the natural world, running between entitlement and theft. Entitlement, I think, is quite a common way of looking at it. The idea that there might be a theft or a crime involved has been explored recently by the lawyer Polly Higgins in her demand to add a fifth crime of ecocide, a fifth crime against peace. But I think it's very common to think that the services provided by the natural world are an entitlement, and indeed to think of them as services, and to believe that people have a right to take what they want. Many people do not relate their purchases to the natural world at all. They're not curious about how raw materials are turned into complex products, and live unaware of what happens when oil is drilled for or minerals extracted. We might point to a number of reasons, a number of ways of having a disturbed relationship to the rest of the natural world. We might point to a state of alienation that has its origin in urban people's distance from the land and the elements, or to the complex relations of production that hide the origins of each product. In the 18th century, it was only a minority who tasted slavery each time they drank a cup of sugar-sweetened tea or chocolate. And perhaps little has changed today. There is also an innocence, however, comparable to the innocence of the infant who is not yet aware of the personal cost to his parents of caring for him or her. As children develop, they come to see their parents as whole people. They become able to show empathy and concern. They desire to give back, and they develop an ethical sense. If people are unaware of ecological debt, we need to ask whether they have never left this state of blissful infant ignorance in relation to the environment, or whether they have returned to it as a defence, seduced and entrapped by its illusions and promises of satisfactions that do not need to be paid for, or whether they are cynically engaged in or colluding in theft, aware at some level of what they are doing. In Great Expectations, Pip's hopes and his blindness relate to his orphan state. All the parental figures are dead, flawed, or inadequate. Joe Gargery cannot protect Pip from the vicious Mrs. Joe. Miss Havisham is embittered. Jaggers is cold. Magwitch is self-centred and demanding. There is no maternal care and no benign paternal authority. Pip is a needy child with a vivid imagination and an extreme and punitive conscience. He is vulnerable to flattery and to the suggestion that he is somehow inexplicably special. He will dream, idealise, persuade himself that black is white, and act in bad faith. He will retreat from the depressive position and have to make a painful return. There are parallels between Pip's world, in which parental relationships are disturbed, and the responsibilities of the generations muddled, and the failures of the contemporary social environment. Just as Miss Havisham is well served in her desire for revenge by the young Pip's narcissistic vulnerability, so the needs of late capitalism for continuing markets are well served by personalities who are alienated from the rest of the world, the natural world, and who are dependent on objects of consumption to sustain their sense of self-worth and identity. As others have pointed out, for example Christopher Lash, we inhabit a culture that encourages narcissism and greed. In neither world is there a strong sense of a strong parental couple creating the necessary boundaries. Pip lacks a strong sense of what Phil Mollen calls lineage, the placing of oneself in terms of gender, parentage and time. Disturbances in lineage are often Oedipal disturbances, failures to recognise the passage of time and one's mortality, failure to recognise oneself as the child of one's parents' relationship, failure to deal with those basic questions of who am I and where do I come from, that bring a sense of being rooted in time, space, family and society, accepting limits and boundaries. Pip's last defensive move in his journey of redemption is to imagine that he will marry Biddy, the only person in his childhood to have shown him maternal affection. His words betray his Oedipal dream. In his fantasy, he imagines that she will receive me like a forgiven child who is in need of hushing voice and a soothing hand. When he arrives back on the marshes, the offer of marriage on his lips, he discovers that unknown to him, Biddy is getting married to Joe. With this move, Dickens asserts the primacy of lineage, and for the first time in the novel, an adequate, loving, parental couple appear in its pages. Pip is forced to accept a place in the world that is both less and more than he had imagined, and there is a sense of both Pip and the world around him being set to rights. In contemporary society, there is a further aspect of lineage that needs to be articulated. Not only do we need to understand ourselves as the product of our parents' relationship, but to see ourselves as part of the hierarchies and history of the natural world, subject to its laws, subject to its finite resources, respecting our place in its systems. In a culture of acquisition and growth, people do not expect to encounter what I have come to call the no of nature. And it is this element that I think we have to restore psychologically and developmentally. We have to enable people to embrace the idea of limits and boundaries in a world that has denied that they should exist. Both Pip's journey and that of people facing ecological debt take place in worlds in which truth is obscured and illusion encouraged. Establishing a realistic relationship to the rest of the natural world and the other people and species who depend on it and live in it and are part of it. This is a difficult task in a culture which denies the need for this. And so my question that I will ask myself was, what happens to the people who try? I've suggested elsewhere in a paper on loss and grief that theories of loss and grief can be very helpful in understanding people's reactions to climate change, and have used William Worden's model of the tasks of grief and their negatives to explore how people may or may not come to terms with the changes required of them by climate change mitigation. There is more to facing ecological debt than mourning, however. Questions of guilt, responsibility, reparation, and the reframing of identity take a more powerful place. In Great Expectations, we see Pip struggling with the nature of love and forgiveness, struggling, as I remarked earlier, with unresolved Oedipal issues, seeking adequate ways of making reparation for the injury he has caused and the ingratitude he has shown. Coming to terms with ecological debt involves equally difficult questions of reparation, repayment, and forgiveness for real harm done. The reframing of identity is often significant, and the potential for depression, masochism, rage, and bitterness are all too real. The processes are both similar and different to those which Pip goes through. If you remember Great Expectations, you will know that Margaret, the convict, reappears in Pip's life, having been transported to Australia, where, having served his time, he makes a fortune through sheep farming. A stormy, windswept night brings him to Pip's lodgings to reveal that he is Pip's benefactor. The knowledge that he might be able to do something good for the child who helped him on the marshes has sustained him through a life of hardship and sorrow. Pip's reactions are shock, disbelief, and denial, experienced as a very powerful physical reaction. Dickens writes, "The repugnance with which I shrank from him could not have been exceeded if he had been some terrible beast." States of repugnance alternate with dejection and distress as he struggles to take in the reality of his situation. The gifts he has received feel tainted. He speaks of his wretched gold and silver. He dreams of running away, enlisting for India as a private soldier. Most tellingly, he feels himself to be useless. "I am heavily in debt, and I have been bred to no calling, and I am fit for nothing." It's clear that many people never get past the stage of shock and disbelief about ecological debt. For those who are genuinely innocent about their connections to ecological damage, the charge is an affront to their sense of themselves as good people. For those like Pip, who may be acting in bad faith, there are powerful motives for continuing to conceal the truth from themselves. Some flee to the equivalent of India in their own minds. Anyone who has tried to raise environmental questions with friends or at social occasions will be familiar with the establishment of a new taboo. "Let's talk about something nicer," said an old friend to me. Some are repelled by ecological damage, but fail to connect it with themselves or wish to disown it, complaining about the ugliness of industrial landscapes, but seeing no connection to their own lives. Some try to kill the messenger, projecting responsibility onto those who have raised the alarm, and this is often apparent in reactions to environmental activists or climate scientists. The triggers for recognition amongst the people I interviewed varied widely. Seeing Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth, picking up a book on vegetarianism, talking with a family member, the oil shocks of the 70s, a TV programme about nuclear testing, a presentation from the Stockholm Institute. Recognition was not always a single shocking moment. A number of people described a gradual development of understanding, as if the difficult knowledge was best managed by being allowed into consciousness bit by bit. Some of the strongest turning points described were from childhood, moments of being brought into contact with nature's limits, or experiencing firsthand the relationship between a life of privilege and one of poverty. One woman wrote, "I was living in Rome as a child in the 60s, and my father was short with us, splashing the hose and play in the garden. He then told us about things like not running taps while cleaning our teeth and turning off the lights. And I remember feeling very sad because so many people around us were not doing this, and we sisters were laughed at when we mentioned it." For people who had made such connections later in life, the sense of shock was still raw. A man whose family values had centred on wealth and ambition, with little acknowledgement of the natural world, said, "It was like opening a credit card bill and finding I had spent hundreds of thousands of pounds. The overwhelm was too much." And a woman told me, still with a sense of her original horror, "I worked out that for each tonne of carbon dioxide I'm responsible for, someone else, somewhere in the world, loses a year of their life." For everyone I spoke to, there was a clear sense of a connection being made, which once established could not easily be turned off again. Once the obscured relationships between ecological damage and the products and services of an ordinary Western life had been made apparent, the knowledge would not go back in the box.
As was described, I work at a research centre at LSE, mainly with economists and scientists. I'm actually a geologist by background, so I come from a very different tradition. So it's an exciting opportunity, I think, for me over the next couple of days to interact with you, and I hope I have many opportunities to talk to you about your perspectives on these issues. But obviously I'd like to start with my discussion of Rosemary's paper, and I think she's provided a thoughtful and perceptive paper that demonstrates the kind of insight that I think is desperately needed among a wide range of professionals like myself who communicate with the public about climate change. Rosemary's paper actually challenges those like me who are part of a community whose professional reputations are based on notions of objective technical analysis of science and economics, to recognize that the efficacy of our communication with a wider audience depends more than we currently acknowledge on an ability to recognize and understand the thoughts and feelings of people about the information we generate and convey. That means my colleagues and I need to engage more with the social sciences and health professions and exchange insights and views, particularly with those such as psychoanalysts who are exploring how people are coping and responding to information about climate change. My colleagues and I consider ourselves to be researchers and definitely not campaigners or environmentalists. Our aim is to investigate and explore technical aspects of the science and economics of climate change and to communicate our findings in a neutral way. Our primary aim is to inform rather than to motivate. We perceive our role as providing factual inputs into rational decision-making processes by individuals, businesses, and governments about climate change. We try to frame the issue of climate change in terms of costs, investments, benefits, and risks, and trust that decision-making is based primarily on assessing these while taking account of broader issues such as socio-economic and political factors. But while my colleagues and I have some notion of what we believe to be appropriate decisions and choices that should be taken in light of our work, we remain mostly separated from the public and their consumption of the information we provide, unlike most of you here. Rosemary's paper provides glimpses of the thoughts and views of individuals who appear to already accept the information provided by mainstream researchers and who have concluded that climate change is a problem that requires action. But the overwhelming sense that drives much of the activities of myself and my colleagues is that the pace and scale of action required to cost-effectively manage the risks of climate change are currently inadequate. And while we recognize that there are many and varied reasons why action is difficult, we also see barriers that appear irrational or based on perspectives governed by commercial interests or political ideologies. This has been exacerbated over the past 12 months by a series of events that appear not only to have raised doubts in the minds of many people about whether climate change even requires action, but also appears to have damaged trust in the technical experts who are regarded as having made the case for action. Many of the researchers I work with worry that the issue of climate change seems too abstract or theoretical, and so seek to draw links with events today in order to convey a sense of immediacy and magnitude about the impacts. For instance, some scientists drew attention to possible links between climate change and flooding in Pakistan and China and the extended heat wave in Russia during the summer, even though attribution of individual weather events to climate change is currently impossible. Yet, while some people may have responded to these speculations by becoming more aware of and or concerned about climate change, others may have become more suspicious of the credibility of those claiming such a link, with some highlighting the occurrence of a cold winter in the UK this year, for instance, as evidence that global warming has stopped or that it isn't even happening. Nevertheless, a survey by Ipsos Mori in March 2010 found that 2/3 of the British public were fairly or very concerned because of, quote, any potential effects of climate change there might be on society in general. While these survey results appear to provide a strong base from which to build public support for action on climate change, only 24% agreed that climate change is mainly caused by human activities, and that's a consensus position that is held by most scientists, for instance, with a further 7% agreeing that human activities are entirely responsible. However, a further 47% thought that climate change is caused partly by natural processes and partly by human activity. And these results indicate that there is confusion about the causes and potential consequences of climate change among a significant portion of the public. And this might be because of uncertainties in the science. Some who are opposed to action on climate change emphasize these uncertainties in order to promote delay or inaction over reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They are drawing on knowledge of the hugely successful way in which this tactic has been employed in the past, particularly by those who lobbied successfully for many years against restrictions on smoking. But the fact that 3/4 of the public accept that humans are at least partly responsible for climate change perhaps explains why 63% tend to agree or strongly agree with the statement that I can personally help to reduce climate change by changing my behavior. But it is important also to recognize that only 10% think that individuals and their families should be mainly responsible for taking action against climate change, compared with 32% who hold national governments responsible and 30% who think that the international community should lead. These survey results, I think, provide interesting context to Rosemary's exploration of the feelings of individuals who seem to have accepted their personal share of responsibility for the ecological debt. In many ways, this is a helpful way of portraying the contribution that every individual makes to climate change directly and indirectly through their activities, even if it is unintentional. However, as Rosemary points out, guilt is not an effective way of motivating most people. Some choose to deny there is a problem when presented with solutions that appear to limit their freedoms, such as travel in cars or planes. I think, and I think this is a major issue that has yet to be really grasped by many people who I work with, that there is some evidence that climate change has been framed along broadly left-wing political lines, with the implication that the only solutions available require some sort of penitence for profligate consumption of products and services that involve the emissions of greenhouse gases. And you can see that, for example, in the way that flying is often portrayed as an unacceptably extravagant behavior or activity, even though it is still a relatively minor contributor to overall greenhouse gas emissions and brings obvious benefits to those who use it as a form of travel. Perhaps a more effective way to generate support and participation from a wider group of people for action on climate change is by linking it to the wider benefits rather than just the repayment of an ecological debt. Many low-carbon technologies, such as electric cars, for instance, offer multiple co-benefits in addition to their value in avoiding the risks associated with climate change. Indeed, the development of these new technologies also promises potential significant and broad opportunities for new jobs and sustainable economic growth and development in both developed and developing countries. This is now recognized by many who seek to mobilize public support on climate change, and is epitomized by the comment that they often make that Martin Luther King did not lead the civil rights movement by declaring, "I have a nightmare." Public opinion surveys show that the majority of the public are willing to take personal steps to reduce emissions and avoid the risks of climate change. I think they will be even more enthusiastic about these actions if they gain even wider benefits. For instance, financial rewards by contributing surplus electricity from household solar panels into the national grid. Being part of the low-carbon industrial revolution should generate excitement and optimism, indeed great expectations, and should motivate action far more effectively than the guilt associated with an ecological debt. Thank you.
Exploring the concept and experience of our indebtedness to the natural world through the lens of Dickens' masterpiece, Great Expectations, struck me as a bold and imaginative idea, and I'd like to begin by thanking Rosemary for her paper. Her reading of the novel brings out clearly a picture of Pitt's pilgrimage towards realisation of his own nature and of his gradual and painful understanding of what has been given to him by others, which places him in the position of a debtor. The story provides us with a very striking and moving representation of a shift from a narcissistic state of mind towards one imbued with the qualities of relationship to self and others.
Louder, can you?
I'll try. Characteristic of Klein's account of the depressive position. Rosemary is specially interested in the near breakdown this entails for Pip. So many assumptions have to be given up. Such a colossal shift in his sense of himself is required of him. She links this with the profound shock and disorientation many people feel as they become aware of what is happening to the ecosystem as a consequence of human exploitation of natural resources, and discusses what can help us to tolerate this new awareness of the risks to ourselves and others, both present and future generations, that our way of life entails. The potential catastrophe spelled out, for example, in Al Gore's film, can, she suggests, have a catastrophic effect on its audience. One might see this as akin to Bion's description of moments of catastrophic change in psychic life, in which nothing looks or feels familiar, and the self must struggle with loss of identity and continuity, feelings of incoherence and helplessness, and the enormous work involved in putting things together internally in a new way. This process also requires the recognition of the provisional and shifting nature of our grasp on reality, if we are to remain in touch with ourselves and not be drawn back into a complacency which can shield us from facing disturbing facts. Now, Great Expectations offers additionally, I think, some very powerful descriptions of experience at a different level, which also is relevant to our response to anxieties about the future of the planet. In the opening scenes on the marshes, both Pip and Magwitch are in a state of terror. For Magwitch, the question of survival is dominant. What he needs is food, which he is helpless to get without help, and the possibility of free movement, which the leg irons impede. He thus demands from Pip what will provide him with an escape from starvation, from the cold, wet marshes so terrifyingly depicted by Dickens, and memorably in visual form in the film version, as we saw, and from the lonely contemplation of the fear of death. The violence of his threats fills Pip with such terror that he risks the all-too-familiar harsh punishment meted out at home to steal what Magwitch has asked for. Pip feels himself to be outside the known world in his encounter on the marshes, distant from the safely familiar, if often unpleasant life he knows. Visions of total hunger, unprotected exposure to the cold and the dark night, and utter isolation are projected into him. They have a resonance within him, which we can link with his orphan state, the nearness to death that is part of his own history. He is vulnerable to Magwitch's threats, in part because of his deep identification with him. He too knows unconsciously the fear of abandonment and the sense of imprisonment at the hands of a powerful persecutor. In this sense, we can see both Pip and Magwitch overwhelmed by the infantile anxieties described so poignantly by Melanie Klein. This is not a world where depressive feelings, depressive guilt, has any place. It is instead one dominated by anxieties about survival and the horror of dependence on unreliable and cruel others. There are no benign adults around, and this makes the helplessness and neediness of the infant and of this infantile state, when it is evoked in later life, a terrible experience. Raw and mediated cold, hunger to which there may be no end, absence of comfort or protection fill mind and body. He had been adopted at about 5, and his early years had included the loss of his mother, the death of a younger sibling in a fire, separation from his other siblings, sexual abuse by one of his mother's partners, and periods of severe neglect and hunger in his first 2.5 years of life, before he was removed from his mother's care. In therapy, he tormented me mercilessly with physical and verbal abuse, ridiculing my attempts to understand him. I got little glimpses from time to time of the unbearable sadness and vulnerability behind his espousal of a tough and cynical identity. One day, he told me that his class at school were doing a play about transportation in the 19th century. He described the scene in the docks as those to be transported as felons were forced onto the ships, and the heartbroken farewells of those on the shore. He had been given the part of one of the children to be transported as a punishment for theft. He sang me the song the children would be singing at the performance of this play, which put into words and music their emotional state. They sang about the fear of cold and heat, hunger and thirst, the unknown monsters of the ocean and of Australia, and of their loss of everything and everyone they knew. Of course, it was something of a stroke of genius by this boy's teacher to provide such an apt container in this drama for his ruptured life experience. And the song served to provide some words for almost indescribable childhood terror. The shared singing by the group of children doubtless expressed the comfort of being able to escape the sense of isolation and loss of identity a child plucked out of his family must endure. Becoming a band of lost children, like the lost boys of Barry's Peter Pan, or Fagin's group in Dickens' other novel, Oliver Twist, is one way out of the sense of nothingness and the terror of not being known or belonging to anyone. On this occasion, my patient could make use of the symbolic potential of the school play to explore feelings of loss, fear of the unknown, a very rare achievement for him. More often, the idea that he could see himself as the rejected outsider, whose survival was so much in doubt. That is, know anything about the belief that this was the person he felt himself to be, was violently denied. Instead, this was to be my fate, to be the object of humiliating revulsion. In one session, this took the form of his taking over the contents of my room to create a comfortable den for himself, from within which he could mock me and pelt me with small objects. I was, he said, a nameless tramp living in a cardboard box by the Thames. That was my home. I got dirty clothes, I stank, and no one wanted to come near me. I picked up rotten food from the ground to keep body and soul together. The vividness of this fantasy was extraordinary, and its impact on my state of mind also striking. I found myself feeling huge, clumsy, exposed and helpless as I struggled to find a place to be, both physically, a sense of having somewhere to put myself in my own room, and mentally, a space in my mind from which I could talk to my patient about this constellation and its meaning. I hope that this clinical vignette helps to convey the quality of what I am referring to as the unbearable, unthinkable infantile terrors that the awareness of global unpredictability can stir up in us. We can feel catapulted from our everyday sense of being at home in the world and feel that our basic sense of security has been brutally stolen from us, leaving us in the dark. What I'm suggesting is at the core of the response to ecological uncertainty and existence and evidence of instability is this more profound level of anxiety. The anxiety perhaps most vividly imagined in our response to actual infants and in our capacity to be in touch with infantile anxieties in ourselves. This idea took shape in my mind when I saw a year ago at 7 Stories the Children's Literature Centre in Newcastle, an exhibition of children's drawings related to climate change, part of a primary school project in local schools. Their pictures were of course shaped by what their teachers had offered them in the classroom. I don't know what that was. But I was struck by the stark depiction in the pictures that their whole known world could disappear. Polar bears, for instance, with no ice in which to make their home, and the loss of their traditional sources of food. Suns which were so powerful that they would burn up the vegetation and burn the skin of humans. Floods which swept away roads and bridges. Piles and piles of rubbish destined to defeat the impulse to conserve and recycle. The everyday metaphor, Mother Earth, is to the point. Infantile dependence on mother's body is where we all start from. First, a protected interior womb space, and later, receptive arms, lap, breast and mind when we are born. This is the prototype for our dependence on the Earth's resources, as well as on each other throughout life. The baby's anxieties about mother's strength and solidity, which has to be adequate to survive infantile aggression, and has to be reliably supported by the wider world, are profound. The loss of trust in the reliable presence and durability of mother's loving care, and the consequent fear of the overwhelming destructive power of our impulses, is what makes the lives of those deprived of this in early years so difficult. When we are confronted with ideas and images in relation to our planet, which echo these primary anxieties, we too are vulnerable to shock and terror, and attempt to defend ourselves from such realities in ways which do not help us to think. This is why, in thinking psychoanalytically about ecological concerns, the depressive anxieties Rosemary described are only a part of the picture. More primitive anxieties lie behind that, and I think that is why it is so hard to think about it.